Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
So, good afternoon and welcome. My name is Kirsten Wiley, and I'm here to introduce and welcome Rick Merrifield, who is visiting us today as part of the Microsoft Research Visiting Speaker Series. He's here today to discuss his new book, Rethink, a business manifesto for cutting costs and boosting innovation. In Rethink, he shows us how to rise above the clutter of your house to expose what does and doesn't need attention in your organization. Rethink guides readers through a strategic rethink to help set a course tailored for them. Rick Merrifield is a former developer. He spent nearly 15 years in various consulting roles helping organizations define and achieve their goals. Since joining Microsoft, Merrifield has spent more than 10,000 hours as a business architect and has filed 12 patent applications, all with the goal of helping companies rethink their operating models and get out of the how trap described in his book. He recently co-authored The Next Revolution in Productivity, a June 2008 Harvard Business Review article focused on case studies that highlight needs of the organization and the opportunity to rethink business operating models before making major technology changes. He's an alumnus of Lakeside School in Seattle and Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. Please join me in welcoming Rick Merrifield to Microsoft. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much, and thanks for coming today. The notion of me being on the visitor series at Microsoft, being also an employee, strikes me as a little bit ironic, but at the same time, being so focused on business productivity, I often do feel like a visitor in a lot of the meetings that I attend. So I'm going to walk through today some of the basic ideas of the Rethink book, explain what the how trap is, talk a little bit about focusing on innovation in particular, because today, being Microsoft Research, obviously, innovation is a big part of what you do as an organization, and one of my great frustrations in discussions about innovation is that people don't define it before they start talking about it, and so I'll offer some thoughts on how I define it. Whether you agree with it or not, you'll at least have a construct with which to have a disagreement with me on the definition. So to get started, in terms of an agenda, I promise that for most of you, you'll see at least one thing very differently today than you've seen it before. And usually have fun with that particular example, go through some actual results that organizations have realized using this approach, and then I'll explain this core idea, what I call the how trap, where people get so attached to how they do their day-to-day activities inside of work as well as at home, it gets very difficult to contemplate doing the work differently. A little bit more on innovation, as I said, getting into a definition, give some examples of innovation to maybe spur some questions there. And then also get into why this notion of a how trap is so easy for people to make a transition and get benefit very quickly. And then I'll tie it into, a lot of people are familiar with Jim Collins' book, Good to Great, and the unifying principle there, which he calls the Hedgehog Concept. And I'll explain how the ideas in the book Rethink complement the notion of the Hedgehog Concept, and so you have an idea of how to use hedgehog thinking as opposed to, or complementary with the Rethink ideas, and I have some closing thoughts. Before I jump into the changing the way you look at things today, I was talking earlier about the process of getting a book published, which was not what I expected. It was a lot more work in areas where I wasn't expecting it. And at the very end of the publication process, in about the March timeframe, the publisher, the Financial Times Press, came back to me and said, okay, we've got this manuscript that's 10 chapters long, and we love this idea of the how trap, and we love the examples, but chapter 1 is too long, and people are going to tail off, and they're not going to read the rest of the book because they're going to lose interest in the middle of chapter 1. And we said, okay, well, how do we solve that? And they said, well, we think you need to break it into 2 different chapters. And we said, fine, we think we can do that, and we see 2 distinct ideas. We can break it into 2 chapters. We did that, spent a lot of extra time breaking into 2 chapters. I'm delighted with how those chapters ended up as making an even better book than it was. But then I went back to the publisher. I said, you know, this is at its heart presented as a business productivity book, and I honestly think now that we've gone from having what was 10 chapters and adding another chapter, there are 11 chapters, and I think it's really bad luck to end a business productivity book in chapter 11. Can't we find some way to either have another section or some other way so we don't end it in chapter 11? I said, no. So we had some fun with that conversation, but they rejected it, and so it does now end in chapter 11. And now, particularly when I'm in the Pacific Northwest, the most of Chapter 11 is about Amazon.com, and so now I'm getting questions say, was it wishful thinking from Microsoft that Amazon's in Chapter 11? No, none of that either. But so that's where we are. It's an 11-chapter book. We've had some good feedback. It's a fun read. It's not very academic. The Harvard Business Review article that I did was much more academic and dense, and this book is designed to be a quick read, and we've had some positive feedback from it. So getting on to the way you see things today, I typically will ask for a show of hands, and I'll spare that today, but most people I know are not aware of the fact that there's a very large arrow in the FedEx logo. And I find that when I tell people that, about 50% of the people that haven't seen it before see it right away. And if you don't see it yet, there it is. And so the reason for showing this as an example is that it's one of those things that once you see it, you can't not see it. And you're probably surprised you hadn't seen it before if you hadn't seen it before today. And this notion of the how trap that I'm going to explain is very similar for most people, where the things that it exposes when you understand this definition, the separation of what the outcome of the work is, what you're trying to do from how you go about it, for most people it's a lot like that arrow in the FedEx logo. It just becomes so obvious that you see all these things all around you that sort of jump off the page or jump off the sort of the opportunity list in terms of, oh wow, it doesn't matter how I do that. This is something that we could do the same as the person in the next cubicle over or what have you. And so it's a fun example for a lot of people to take a very familiar logo and in many cases expose something that people just haven't noticed before. And if you hadn't seen it before, you'll always see that arrow from now, and I promise in at least 3 to 6 months you'll disassociate me from the arrow and you'll just see the arrow as it is and go from there. So real results, I do these slides both as a summary and then I'll echo them later after I've explained this notion of a how trap. So I'll quickly give the 3 examples of cost cutting, and I point out that we don't have logos of the companies that we achieve this with in cost cutting, because typically the cost cutting results we get from customers are in the neighborhood of 10 to 20 times what they expected, but they're so embarrassed that we found them so quickly and that the magnitude was so much greater than they expected, and partly also because some of them are public companies and they feel that there may be some shareholder retribution, they don't let us name them. So unfortunately the first example, very large manufacturer in Europe that you all would recognize by name, they were trying to deploy a service-oriented architecture, which at the time was the hot new thing. And the leader of information technology said, we think the best way to start this and really demonstrating business value to the organization is by eliminating some duplication, and we're pretty sure that in the area of verifying zip codes, a piece of software that a lot of organizations subscribe to on an annual basis, it costs between $2 and $3 million for whether it's marketing mailers or for billing purposes. It's pretty important to have correct addresses and zip codes or postal codes. And they said, we're pretty sure we're investing in this thing twice. Well, it turns out in 3 weeks, we found significantly more than that and realized benefit in less than 3 months of over $40 million, and we redeployed 65 heads. And one of the important messages there was that the IT department got the money and gave it back to the business and saying, okay, here's where there was waste and repetition. Now let's invest this money that we've just given back to you in innovation and things that can really help the company differentiate and have people have a more positive experience with the organization. So that was a great example. The next one's a big bank in the northeastern part of the United States. Similar fact pattern where they said, we've got this thing called wire data services where we subscribe to stock quotes and investment price instruments, Bloomberg, Dow Jones, Reuters, that kind of thing. And they said, we're pretty sure we're wasting $2 or $3 million a year on that. It was a very sort of humble expectations project. And in 8 weeks, we found over $23 million of repetitive spend just because it had been masked by, well, explained a little bit as this how trap. The last example that I use for a number of reasons, where zero savings were realized at a big logistics firm in the United States. They brought us in. They had 5 different divisions of transportation. There was a truck division. There was a partial truckload division. Vessels, airplane, and train were among the divisions they had. And they said, we think there's probably about 10 or 15% overlap in the work that goes on in these different divisions. And we found in less than 8 weeks it was over 80% overlap in terms of what the work was, and there was an opportunity for significant consolidation and analysis of best practices. They didn't realize any of those savings because it got hung up in office politics. They knew that they should do this. It was the right thing for the business, but for a variety of political reasons it got hung up and they didn't actually execute and realize any of the savings. And I include this here, and And in the book, because I find one of my frustrations with some of these business productivity books is that everything is so rosy and all of your problems are going to be solved if you just read the book. Well, the ideas of the book are sound and have been proven to be sound, but there still are things that can trip you up in realizing the benefits. So as a sort of a cautionary tale, there are things that are going to prevent you from necessarily realizing the benefits, as this particular organization did, much to our frustration. When it comes to innovation, the customers where we help them out or work with them love for us to use their logos because they're so proud of those particular innovations. And I'll spend time talking about both of these particular organizations more, but ING Direct is great not just for banking, but I think particularly in this economic climate for a lot of organizations, they found some really innovative ways to cut costs. And I often will point out that people see cost cutting and innovation as mutually exclusive when in fact some of your best opportunities for innovation are in the areas of cost cutting. So for them as an operating model, as an online retail bank, they decided most retail banks have their business as the branch-based business. We're not going to have any branches in our retail bank. Eliminated a huge cost element from their operating model and allowed them to deliver a lot more savings to their customer. They also don't allow customers to write paper checks. And what that does is allow them to eliminate the department that handles bounce checks, which is a pretty significant expense for a lot of retail banks. The more important point that I like about ING Direct that also happens at Eclipse Aviation is that ING Direct turns their backs on some customers. They say, you know what, we have a really clear value proposition. We deliver high interest rates in savings accounts. And if that's what you want, that's what we deliver. If you want us to hold your hand on the phone for customer support, take your business elsewhere. If you want a branch, take your business elsewhere. And having the ability to be that clear about what they're delivering and connecting that with what a customer wants, I think particularly in an economic downturn is something we need to help a lot of our customers do more effectively, to say, this is our value and this isn't our value. And if somebody wants that, they need to go somewhere else because this is what we're doing. And it may not be just one thing. I'll talk more about with this notion of the Hedgehog Concept. You may be delivering multiple value propositions, but still be clear about what you are delivering and what you're not delivering. Same thing at Eclipse Aviation, which is a company that was run by a guy named Vern Rayburn, who used to be the original, one of the original marketing executives at Microsoft back when Microsoft was still based in Albuquerque. Rayburn realized that there was a huge opportunity for private jets to have, so at that time the least expensive private jet was about $5 million. And Rayburn realized that through a variety of innovations, he could come to market with a $1 million private jet. And there was a huge underserved market for people who were willing to pay more than commercial but couldn't afford the $5 million private jet and proved that there's a huge market for that. I'm not going to spend as much time talking about some of the manufacturing specific innovations that they did, but the point about Eclipse turning their back on some customers. Eclipse doesn't allow you to customize the interior of your private jet. So a lot of the costs in private jets are the kind of leather you have in your seats and the kind of fabric that you have, and a lot of other factors go into the cost and extend the timeline. And Rayburn said, you know what, I'm willing to bet that there are people who just want private jets for transportation, and even though they want it to be nice inside, they don't care what color leather it is. And in fact, that was one of the biggest areas of cost cutting for him in the overall process. He said, this is what we're delivering. We're delivering low-cost private jet. If you need customization, call the next, you have to spend $4 million more at least to get that. The other one he did that's a little bit more disruptive that wrinkles some people's noses, he eliminated the bathroom from the jet. And he said, these are short-haul flights. They're not going to go in the air more than 2 or 3 hours. People just need to plan ahead. And that eliminated a huge amount of weight from the jet, which also helps with fuel economy and deliver a lot of other things in the process. But getting people out, people assume that you have to have a bathroom on an airplane, and Rayburn proved that was not the case. Okay, so getting this core notion of what I call the how trap, very much a human condition, affects all of us. I'll give you some examples here, some outside of the workplace and some more in the workplace. Most of us have a favorite restaurant or a favorite destination. And as time marches on, we start to associate the route we take with that destination, so much so that when we get in somebody else's car, there's this why are we going this way conversation that most of us have had with somebody at one point or another. Really doesn't matter how you get there as long as you achieve the outcome of getting to the destination on time. Similarly, the Fosbury Flop, a guy named Dick Fosbury, who was an Oregon-based athlete in the 60s, was a high jumper. And he realized in the 60s that most people at the time did the high jump, the scissor kick, much the way people do the hurdles still today. And he said, okay, if the outcome, what I need, the measurement of success is getting higher over the bar than anybody else, he figured out that turning 180 degrees the other way and going backwards over the bar got a better result and got him an Olympic gold medal. And the Fosbury Flop is now the way people jump over the high bar, and most people don't even remember that it used to be done any differently. But as an individual accomplishment where one person tested, does it really matter how I get over the bar? No, I could do better doing it another way. Fosbury is a great example of an individual getting out of a how trap. So those are non-work examples that may resonate with you. Now, more into the work environment, if I am doing a business requirements document, or if I'm a consultant doing something with a company and I don't know anything about the company or even the department that I'm talking to, if I walk up to a person at the fax machine and say, look, I'm just trying to get a sense of what your work is, I may be trying to help optimize it, I may be trying to cut costs or innovate, tell me what you're doing. And the person at the fax machine is going to say, probably tilt their head sideways a little bit and say, well, I'm sending a fax. In a lot of business requirements gathering discussions that go on today, the person's going to say, oh, okay, is sending a fax a necessary step in your job? Do you have to do that to be successful, or is it one of a sequence of process workflow steps? And in that conversation, the person's going to say, yes, it's a necessary step for me to do my job successfully. If I were to say, okay, what you're doing here is communicating the status of something or maybe confirming the order, how you're accomplishing it is with a fax machine by disentangling, in a very simplistic way, disentangling what I'm doing from how I'm doing it. I can now test with that end user, say, okay, if you're, say we're calling it communicating status, if what you're doing is communicating status, does it really matter whether you use a fax machine or whether somebody else does it or whether it's outsourced? If you accomplish that outcome with whatever performance objectives, metrics you have, can we change how it's done? Maybe we even automate it. Typically, about 90% of the time, I found that conversation ends up convincing the end user that it doesn't matter how it happens. It's fine that they keep doing it that way, but if there's a different way that helps them be more successful or frees up time, they're fine with it. And it's not, if you were to challenge at the fax discussion, if the previous method was say, okay, it's a requirement to use a fax, well, I think we can automate it. That's a much more sort of collision-oriented conversation where I'm the non-expert challenging the work that the person's doing. They're like, well, how dare you suggest that I'm the expert of my job? Whereas when you separate this what and how, they're like, okay, now I'm looking at my work differently. I realize that the fax is the how, and it may not matter how I do it. It's a much more elegant way to test whether it matters at a tactical level how the person's doing their job. The flip side of that example, if United Airlines were to call Microsoft today and say, look, we've got this, we're an airline, we've got this area where people have to check in for their flights, and it's a very commodity function for our industry. We think we can cut some costs out of it. Can you help us? A lot of the Microsoft people and partners who get that call today will say, well, Microsoft doesn't have a product called Flight Check-in, so I don't really know what to do with that. Can you give us some more information? In some cases, the conversation will stop there. If United Airlines had said, okay, we've got this thing we call Flight Check-in, but it's really made up of 3 separate steps that don't have anything to do with the airline industry. There's confirming a reservation, conducting a survey, and if they've got luggage, there's some logistics. Well, if the problem statement is presented to Microsoft or anybody that way, say, okay, well, we've got lots of case studies on reservations, surveys, and logistics. Now let's get specific about what specific performance improvements you think you're looking at. Is it a customer service change? Can we talk about your technical architecture and get into a much richer conversation just because the irrelevant attributes of the problem have been stripped away, and you can really hold it up and say it's reservations, surveys, and logistics. That's what the problem I'm trying to solve. Then get specific about metrics, performance change, customer service, all other things that we can help them with, that we have mountains of case studies from best practices to technical architecture to service-oriented architecture to cloud things. We now know for that particular example, it literally doesn't matter who does the work. It could be us in our hotel room. It could still be the airline employee behind the counter. It doesn't matter where it happens. It doesn't matter what the technology is, as long as the outcome of those 3 things is getting accomplished. So those are some orienting examples on this basic notion of a how trap that we found to be very simple but effective in terms of changing the conversation to make sure people are really focused on the outcome of their work. So as a little more detailed example, I find that once you sort of can spot these trap verbs, and I've got some of them listed here on the left, it's easier to see them and say, oh, that's a how verb. What is the what verb that I should be using in place of that? It's fine to know that that's how it's happening today, but I should have a what verb that connects to the how. This is an actual process workflow diagram from a very large local company that sells insurance for the products that it makes. And so I got mailing the agreement here, faxing the agreement. So they're all how verbs. And over on the side, I put communicate, confirm, register, complete, and transport. The automate maps to the none. Automate is kind of a funny word because it's not really a how word and it's not really a what word. And so when I talk about that, some people have tried to push automation in one category or another, and it's really neither, which is why I call it a none. The last point here, when you sit down with somebody to talk to them about their job, they're going to be inclined to use how words because they're so used to describing how they do the job on a day-to-day basis. It's not really their job in most cases to describe their job to somebody else. So don't fault the person for using how language because it's not really their job to do that. And the better able you are to help them separate the what's from the hows, the quicker, more rapidly you can get to a more objective conversation on where they are. A quick note, this is not the same as process, and some people confuse process and this what language that makes up the heart of what we call business architecture. Process is workflow, really the animation of what the work is. And so in this case, you see a start and an end arrow, and that's a great process workflow. One of the issues with process is because it tends to be encumbered with this how language, it tends to be very subjective. So if you have 5 different people in the department that are creating the insurance quote, if you sit down with them individually and have them map out a process workflow, you're probably going to get 5 different pictures, which if you have the definition of what the work is first, can be really helpful to get those 5 different perspectives and say, well, one person may have more air handling, one person have more interaction with a partner, and understand what some of those different permutations are so that when you are looking at 1, what's most valuable, 2, how things are performing, you have some different inputs and some of the different perspectives from the different departments. What tends to be a far more durable lens than the how language. So, for instance, sending a fax to the insurance agent, I happen to know this company's been selling insurance policies for over 80 years. If that is communicating the status of the insurance policy to the agent, they've probably been doing that communication for 80 years. They haven't been using the fax machine for 80 years. And so seeing that you can have this more durable lens on what the work is and the more transitional implementation-based how language on top of it makes for a really elegant connection between process and business architecture, or the what's. Why this is effective, and so now I'm going to take this create quote example and build a map of the what's and then show an example of one of the heat maps that we'll do that really brings to life some of the discussion that we have with organizations. Because you're having this what-how conversation, it's a very different conversation from what the end user is used to having, so they often get immediate value from it rather than just, oh, another process discussion. I just had Accenture in here 6 months ago, and they don't see it as value-added activity. The deliverable they get from this in half an hour to 45 minutes typically is a different lens on their work, and they're usually excited to see it and they're more eager to participate in it. The other piece, like the fax example, you often don't have to be an expert consultant to go in and sit down with that person to have the conversation. Just being able to spot the how verbs and figure out what the what is enables people who are not business consulting experts, even the people in the department already, to flush out some of the differences in their work and really start to test whether it matters how they do certain things, which then informs or helps inform the prioritization of what work is most important for them, what projects are most important. And then once you've teased out this what, which is an important first step, then you can start to attach things like business value, performance, the maturity of the work, interconnectedness, which I get further into in the definition of the book. But attaching those things can really help, again, inform prioritization of work. So now I'm going to overlay on top of the hows, the what's, and it's not important to everybody that we read those, but just I overlay those. In the middle here there's a rekey into an application, so I'm not going to move that one over. So there's 6 child what's that make up the create insurance quote, and I'll pull that off to the right. So you've got the 6 children inside of a parent. That by itself is not particularly magical to the end user at this point in the conversation. Say, okay, those are what's, that makes sense. I get the difference between what and how. The more pivotal point in the conversation is where you ask them what's most valuable, what's least valuable, how are things performing, what's performing well, what's not performing well. It turns out that most end users have a pretty good sense, whether it's assertion-based or metric-based, have a pretty good handle on what's most valuable, least valuable, what's performing well, and what's not performing well. So if you add coloring, so in the case of performance, each child here, so the 6 children have an outline color that denotes performance. So this is a green performance, which means it's performing well. A pink border means it's performing poorly. The parent, create quote, has the same color scheme. So the pink border means it's not performing well. The interior color, the fill value, denotes responses to business value. So if somebody's got a pink or red interior, that means it's high value. And if it's got a green fill, that means it's low value. So once we've got this view, someone says, okay, I think we should make a big investment in the area of creating insurance quotes. I'm not convinced. Just on this alone, if the performance is bad, that's one thing. But if it's only medium value, there may be other areas in my organization that I want to look at. So I probably need to get a larger organizational view to say if it makes sense for me at all to even invest in creating an insurance quote. Then if the decision is yes, we probably should invest in creating an insurance quote, then what? Well, we see a couple of different combinations of children. There's one in the top right that's got a pink interior and a red border, which means it's high value and underperforming. And so it's tempting to look at that and say, well, that may be the one that will pivot or cause the parent to perform better, since it's the most valuable and underperforming of all the children. If I also am thinking about it from a cost-cutting perspective, maybe I want to look at the most low-value thing that's already performing well and say, maybe I could outsource that. Maybe there's a partner, if I'm looking at, say, sending the agreement, maybe there's a third-party fulfillment house that can do that low-value activity better, faster, cheaper than I can. And if it's already performing well, then why not? The next steps are beyond the innovation. Where would I improve it? Testing what children will cause the parent to perform better. That's a conversation that most people don't have a map of that's handy for them today to talk about. And they're like, oh yeah, I understand the notion of causality. I understand parent-child relationships. And now if I can test which child will cause the parent to perform better, which one I can go ahead and change because it doesn't matter how it gets done, I can outsource it. A very different conversation from what most end users are used to having. Then as a next step, if they don't already have concrete metrics, attach metrics to it and say, okay, if I know what specific performance measures I think I should get from this, what's that going to cost? Is that a people change, a process change, or a technology change? And get into the cost-benefit analysis of the conversation. And then broad brush strokes, the child metrics and coloring should align with the parent. So with a parent that's medium value, it makes sense to have an array of value and high value and low value work. Similarly with performance, with a pink border for creating a quote, it makes sense to have a blend of high performance and low performance things. And that's something that you tend to have to eyeball, because sometimes there's going to be the five of the children will only happen infrequently, and one of the 6 children will be the one that really gets done all the time, and that will be the pivot always for the parent. And that becomes sort of a matter of familiarity with the work. But again, most times the end user knows which will cause that performance pivot. So hopefully now you're starting to see the FedEx arrow analogy, and you're getting the difference between this, as simple as it is, that pulling the what away from the how makes for a much more objective, transparent conversation with people about not only what the work is, but then where do you need to prioritize to make changes. As I said, I did some innovation-specific slides for this crowd. In my definition of innovation, or when I hear people talk about innovation, there's a lot of people who I think are talking more about creativity, like lightning striking, like, oh, we've got this great idea, now what are we going to do with it? I think of innovation more in terms of being on the change spectrum. So when somebody comes and says, we need to cut cost or we need to respond to this competitive pressure, my response is, okay, do we need to do like a minor tuning scorecard change? Is that the right kind of change to respond to the challenge? Or is it more like a big project, like a remodel, where the work's going to resemble what was there before, but it's going to be clearly different? Innovation is on the far end of that spectrum where the outcome is the same, and so airport check-in is not a bad example, but it doesn't resemble what was done before. Checking in for a flight on the web doesn't resemble the experience of talking to the airline employee, but it accomplishes the same outcomes of confirming your reservation, conducting a survey, and managing logistics if you've got that. And so asking the question, say, is the right response to do the minor change, the project, or the innovation, helps people get innovation on the table of every conversation. So it's not a specialty activity. It's every day when I look at a problem, is innovation the right answer? And then the cost-benefit equation you can see. So my examples here, we've got, for a simple change, free checking is something that didn't take retail bankings that much of an effort to do, and it probably did improve their numbers. On a project basis, automated bank statements, that's probably something that took a fair amount of work for banks to do. And then innovation, the ATM, where you actually take the bank teller and push the teller to the outside of the bank or even to your 7-Eleven or what have you. You're still getting your cash, but the experience doesn't resemble going into the bank and talking to the teller, and the teller knows who you are and maybe knows your dog's name. Radically different experience. So that's a admittedly simplistic definition, but that's how I define innovation. From there, I think of innovation in a couple of different categories. You've got simply a better how it gets done versus there are new what's people are doing. So in the better how, Netflix is simply a better how I rent videos, right? Or any other service like that. You don't have to go to the store anymore. I get my movies through the mail. I send it back whenever I want. The additional benefit of not having to pay late fees is just a perk. ATM is a better how people can get money because they can do it anywhere they are and you don't have to be attached to the bank hours anymore. The Nano car from Tata Motors that they're selling for $2,000, it's just a cheaper car. They figured out a way to slash the cost out of a car, and both from a manufacturing perspective as well as a price point, it's just a better method for a lot of people. It may not be as safe as it needs to be yet, but it's a cheaper car. FedEx and Amazon sort of straddle the better how and the new what, and I'm going to come back to them. The new what's, I actually think email is in many respects is a new what, in the sense that when we first started using it, we had this mentality of, and I've got this graphic on the top from the New York Times, it's brand new but make it sound familiar. A lot of innovations like the automobile, when it first were introduced, people didn't have any sense, like, why would I buy this, was the initial reaction. Until people called it the horseless carriage, people said, oh, this is an alternative to the carriage. And then, of course, cars evolved to be much more than that. I think with email, people started, the metaphor was, okay, paper-based letters and memoranda, the notion of how we use email today as a replacement for dialogue, almost replacing the phone in a lot of cases in terms of quick questions. It's evolved in really a new way of how we communicate with people, sometimes work people, sometimes socially, and in many respects it's a new what. Fan base is an evolution of social networking where they take, it's a Wikipedia for non-professional sports essentially. So high school and college sports, it gets people to register their high school soccer team and have all the names of that, and allows a connection to people who have some association with each other that was never really possible as rich an experience as you get from fan bases as they've done. OnStar, all of the onboard information in cars, where you can not only have a lot of information pushed to the driver about the health and wellness of the vehicle, as well as finding the nearest McDonald's or whatever they need to do. That's something that people I don't think could have even really imagined 20 years ago. The other piece with OnStar that I think comes out in January is that when there's a collision with OnStar, they collect some crazy number, like 100 pieces of information from the vehicle, and immediately transmit it to the OnStar database, which pushes into some huge repository of crash histories, which then crunches those numbers, and then immediately, or as quickly as it takes to crunch it, they push it out to the emergency service organizations so they can tell the fire department and the emergency response unit, say, this is what kind of crash it is, based on our data, this is the likelihood of serious injuries, this is the kind of equipment you should bring, this is where it is, you're going to need scuba gear, all that kind of stuff. They're going to do it in an instant. It's going to be sent out to the emergency response teams within seconds of when the accident actually happens. So the kinds of things that OnStar is doing are, I think, really exciting, and they're using Microsoft Earth for the images. Coming back to FedEx and Amazon, I think both of them are examples where they started with something familiar. Amazon was selling books, FedEx was selling overnight mail, but both of them have evolved into something so much more that we don't really think of FedEx and that type of service as an alternative to mail. It's just a different way of, it's just a different service. It's just as Amazon has evolved really into being more of a software company than a book, at least in their description. They're more of a software company now, and the backbone of a lot of internet transactions more than just the bookseller. But I don't think either FedEx or Amazon would have necessarily gotten there if they hadn't started out with something familiar and built on that. Operating models, an innovative operating model, I spent a lot of time with the Newman's Own organization a number of years ago. And what was interesting to me about them, and I'd read about them in the New York Times, a lot of people from the outside world think of them as just another food service company that happens to give all their profits to charity, which is, again, broad brushstrokes. That's true. That's what Newman's Own's about. The more interesting thing to me was that this company that now has revenues over $200 million has fewer than 20 employees. And so for them, they didn't care about running a business. Paul Newman only cared about having really high quality recipes, and they have a really super kitchen in their office, and giving profits to charity. Everything else for the company was outsourced. And so a lot of times when I go into customers, I'll say, Paul Newman was really clear about what he valued and what he didn't value in terms of running a business. Are you that specific? Do you just keep growing your business because you think other companies in your industry are doing that? Or are you really being specific about what's most valuable to you and to your customers? And so in that sense, it's a good example. The Costco example that I like to use, if most people here are obviously familiar with Costco, if you compare them to Sam's Club, what goes on in both of those organizations is nearly identical. But their operating models and how they get their profit turns out to be radically different. Sam's Club is a very traditional retail model where they care about whose products are on their shelves. They negotiate really onerous supplier agreements, drive the prices down in terms of what they're willing to pay, and they put margin on top of that, and that's where Sam Clubs gets their profits. Costco, by contrast, doesn't make any money selling their products by choice. They also don't care whose products are on their shelves. They'll put anybody's products on their shelves. One week it may be Hellmann's mayonnaise, it may be Best Foods the next. They make their profits from their membership dues. And so they light their stores brightly, they have friendly employees, they're giving food away all the time. But if a high-priced consultant were to go into Costco and drop in retail industry best practices, they would destroy value by not knowing the differences in the operating model of Costco. The other example that I like to use, that I get some nose wrinkles on campus when I use this example, if you think about the Coca-Cola company, they're a company that doesn't make anything. They create intellectual property. Everything they sell, including Dasani water, starts as a powder. I like to think of it as the only just add water. They sell it to the bottlers and distributors, and they then put it in the containers, and they sell it to the end consumer. So they create intellectual property. They also spend a lot of money on branding and marketing. And so I'll often ask groups at customers, say, name another company that you can think of that doesn't make anything, doesn't really sell much to their end consumers, and only spends money creating intellectual property and branding and marketing. Microsoft, right. So the good news is, by seeing the improbable comparison of companies that aren't in the same industry, there are all kinds of opportunities for best practice analysis between Coca-Cola and Microsoft, and we have had some of those conversations by stripping, again, the way some of this how language and some of the industry expectations, these are companies in completely different industries that are actually doing very similar things in many respects. All right, one more slide on operating model. This is I can't take credit for building this slide. The woman who wrote Blue Ocean Strategy, Renee Moborn, did this. But it's a good example, in my opinion, of looking at Starbucks and saying they listed out a bunch of the qualities that go into the experience of buying a cup of coffee. Quality, speed, convenience, fashion, selection, ambience, price, location, and service expertise. And they said, okay, what does the rest of the industry put emphasis on, and what are we going to emphasize differently? And they picked out different things. Here's what the industry cares about, and here's what we care about, and here's where they're different. One of the ones that often comes up as a question mark is, the green circles are Starbucks, and the red squares are others like Dunkin' Donuts and Denny's and other places where you can get a cup of coffee. And they'll say, well, why is price down on the bottom for Starbucks and Denny's is high up? And the response is because Starbucks doesn't care how much they charge for their coffee, and Denny's cares a lot. So that's the emphasis point. It's not that Starbucks is cheap. It's just they don't care how much they charge for their product. That's not part of the value proposition to their customer. And so each of those decisions is what they emphasize, what they value, versus what they don't care about. And so that turns out to be a picture is a fairly illustrative, familiar example at a little more detailed level than what I've been talking about of sort of what an organization cares about and what it doesn't care about. Some additional trapping ideas I like to talk about. I mentioned the flight check-in, that's artificial. There's no need to really get into that as being an airline-specific problem to really see where the opportunities for the improvement are. Value confusion. I'm going to go back to Starbucks for a moment, where you talk about internet connectivity in a coffee shop. The question I often will ask people is, say, do you think that's more of a marketing expense for Starbucks, where they're trying to bring people into the store, keep them there so they buy more coffee and donuts and CDs and newspapers? Or is it an actual product itself, if they're charging for it, where it's a source of revenue and that's a standalone metric by which it should be judged? And I'll often get a lot of feedback from people who say, oh, it's a marketing thing. No, it's a sales thing. My response is, it doesn't matter. What matters is that it has a specific job and it gets measured for what its job is. So when times get tough, you say, let's look at this Wi-Fi thing in the store and say, if its job is to bring people in and sell more coffee, donuts, and CDs, is it doing that job? And if it's not, how do we treat it differently? Should we eliminate it, or we should invest more heavily to get that metric up? Or if it's a product, is it driving enough revenue for us to keep it as a product? Is it profitable enough to keep it as a product? In reality, it's a little bit of I happen to know at Starbucks, it's a little bit of a blend of both when they're still charging for it. But that's one of the things. I see a lot of work in organizations where people just have and say, yes, we have to do it. And they'll say, okay, what's its job? Well, you know its job. I know I don't. Tell me, is it a marketing thing? Is it a sales thing? Is it a commodity thing? And be specific. Have a specific metric about what its job is. The last one, Toshiba had in their consumer laptop repair group a number of years ago a problem where it was taking several days, actually over 9 days, it was like 11 days, to turn around a consumer laptop for repair. And then and now, most people can't be away from their laptops for 11 days. So they looked at it and they said, well, what's going on? Why is it taking 11 days for us to turn this thing around? Long story short, they figured out that it was taking only about 45 minutes of actual laptop technician repair time to fix the laptop. And all the rest of the time was the orchestration of getting the laptop from the consumer, getting it to the repair station. If they had to order parts, they'd have another UPS truck go get a part and bring it back, and then the technician could fix it, and then they'd call UPS again and have them deliver it to the consumer. And that was what was consuming all the time. Well, they said, hang on, this is not really a laptop repair problem with a logistics component. It's really a logistics problem that has a tiny laptop repair component. We're a technology company. We're not a logistics company. We should outsource this whole problem to a logistics provider, which they did, and UPS took the whole thing on, including hiring the laptop repair technicians, and they ended up getting the average laptop repair time down to less than a day and a half because UPS is good at logistics. So that's I think a lot of problems have the wrong labels on them, and that's a good example of one where it just had completely the wrong label, and so they were chasing after it as a technology problem when it was not. The why now, some of this is fairly obvious. For the last 20 years, a lot of industries have been in constant growth mode, constantly just keeping up with the growth, moving as fast as we can. Yeah, waste and inefficiencies creeping into my operating model, that's fine, we'll get to it eventually. Well, we're there now. And what most people I'm finding are saying, well, we've got some waste and inefficiency that's crept in. Well, it turns out the waste is gigantic, that over 20 years, most people expect X when they should actually expect to find 10X waste and redundancy, inefficient processes, even drifting the business into an operating model that has no direct connection in terms of what their customers value, not really knowing who their customers are and are not. So it makes it very difficult for them to tune where they need to cut costs, let alone where they need to innovate. A little bit like the FedEx arrow, once you see it, it becomes so obvious, it's a little bit tempting for organizations to blame people and say, how did you not see this? You're stupid. Nothing good will come of that conversation. Because it is such a different lens for most people, because things become so obvious for most people, the message is get on with it, realize the savings, see the opportunities for innovation, and take advantage of it. The final point is that because you'll see so much repetition, most organizations will see so much repetition work. It's a great opportunity, not just for technology, but also best practices. I mentioned this notion of the hedgehog concept, from good to great. A lot of people are familiar with it, but if you're not, the hedgehog, the unifying idea of this particular book, Jim Collins says you need to focus on this intersection of what you can be best in the world at, what you're most passionate about, and what drives your economic engine. And the center of that is what he calls the hedgehog, and that's what the singular thing you should be focused on as an organization. I think it's good advice to help organizations be really clear about that particular, what really should we as an organization be focused on. The reality is most large organizations are not that simple. This Venn diagram has 7 different points in it. The hedgehog is just one point. So it's possible that what drives your economic engine can intersect with what you can be best in the world at, but isn't something you're deeply passionate about. That sort of stuff happens all the time. Concur Technologies is a local software company that ran into that a number of years ago, where their licensed software business was in that part of the Venn diagram. They wanted hosted expense management software to be their hedgehog. And so they, for a number of years, had to make these trade-offs. They said, well, we have to keep funding this one thing that isn't our hedgehog because it's still driving our economic engine, but we also still have to keep investing in our hedgehog. And I'll tell you that you're going to find things that touch all 7 areas of that Venn diagram. And one of the things that you'll find hopefully helpful from the Rethink book is that by doing the kinds of heat maps that are discussed in the book, you can have this conversation about parent-child relationships, value, performance, maturity, and say, whether or not it's in my hedgehog, is it something I need to be investing in, or is it something that I can ignore? Just because this established account revenue gaps is high value and underperforming, if its parent is performing well, I'm not sure I should invest in it. Maybe I can ignore that thing and have those kinds of conversations as a complement to the hedgehog notion. And so that's a simple overview in terms of how to think of the heat mapping and prioritization of work as a complement to Collins' hedgehog. All right, some closing thoughts, then we can open up to questions. It's tempting for a lot of organizations to chase after the really high-value work. The problem with, or the risk with that, is that if it's high value, if you make mistakes, the mistakes can really be painful. My recommendation is start with the lower value areas of the business, because if as you learn any new methodology, you're going to have some lessons learned. Learn the lessons in a low value area that's going to be less impactful. Get familiar with what it does as a method that may be different from Six Sigma or Lean or process reengineering or whatever method or software development lifecycle you're using. And then once you've got that, then point the lens at the higher value stuff, and I think you'll have better success with that. a lot of managers are going to be familiar with the notion that somebody runs in their office and they has, oh, this is the number one most important thing we need to be doing in this organization. If we just fix this, everything will be fine. A lot of managers don't have a vehicle to push back and say, I'm not sure that's right. Are you sure that is going to cause my department to perform better? That's the one thing that's more important than anything else. Heat maps prove to be a way for the person to say, okay, show me a heat map that says not only this is the number one or these are the two or three most important things, but show me in parent-child relationships why the reason for your assertion that this is going to flip the performance of the parent or the department or the organization as a whole. Much more objective, less confrontational way to have that conversation. And if it turns out that the person is wrong, that their one thing isn't the most important, instead of just saying you're wrong, they'll go, oh, now I see why my shiny object project is maybe not going to be done until next year. Here, I now understand why you've made the decision to invest in these other things. We'll eventually get there, but it's actually not the number one most important. So they're not just getting dismissed, they're being heard, and they're also seeing why prioritization decisions are being made in the organization. As I said, a lot like the FedEx era, once you see it, you can't not see it, and it's tempting to judge people for not seeing it. No good will come of that. Just get on with it. Expect people to see things that they've never seen before and have fun with it. It turns out to be fun, and getting people talking about the how trap and applying it to their work does tend to be fun, and hopefully this has been an interesting talk for you and that you can tell me some of your stories about getting out of the how trap. You can find me on campus, but there is a book website, which is rethinkbook.com, or you can also send a note to rethink@microsoft.com if you don't want to use my name in the email for some reason. So with that, hopefully this was interesting, a good use of your time. If you have any questions, I'd love to hear them. Yeah.
I just have a good example of something where that almost happened. It was pretty close. I was actually meeting with British Airways earlier this year, and they had mentioned that they were in final discussions to buy a telepresence company.
To buy a
telepresence?
Okay, yep.
High-end video conferencing. Mm-hmm. And what we've been saying is that, so I'm in the travel group here, what we've been saying is that we don't want to fly anywhere. We don't care about flying. We don't care about hotels. We don't care about any of that. We care about getting business done.
Right.
And that those are the most likely companies to step in. And it is just interesting that they were really thinking that they're not in the business of flying people.
Right.
Which I think is a pretty big change.
Yeah, that's the what I call paving the cow path, where people just are so attached to some outdated notion they're trying to optimize something that actually isn't a valid assumption anymore necessarily. And I think you're right. Travel is something that some people just got so used to. Yep, I got to fly to go to solve that problem, rather than, oh, we can just do this as a con call or as a video teleconference. I think it's going to be one of those 10-year overnight success stories where people in 10 or 15 years are going to be so much more accustomed to having teleconferences for things that were just assumed that were necessary as a face-to-face meeting.
We're already 10 years into it.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. I wasn't going to. Okay, 20-year overnight success story. Questions?
So since your book talk about cutting costs,
Cutting costs and innovating. Yep.
did you talk anything about laying off employees as one way of cutting?
Question is whether it talks about laying off employees. No, there isn't a specific topic about laying off employees, but in this economy that obviously has to come up. And there's a slide that I often will show that I didn't today. One mistake I find a lot of organizations making right now is all the doom and gloom in the news, everything, the recession is affecting everybody equally. Turns out that about 20% of industries have grown in the last year and a half. And so some companies that sort of get into this cost-cutting mentality is the wrong direction for them to take, and they just aren't even realizing necessarily their business is actually growing and doing quite well. And so my message is, sure, if you're an automobile manufacturer in the U.S., it's probably going to be a pretty bumpy road for you for a long time. And there's nothing I can do to help that. And I'm unfortunately going to blame them for a lot of the mess that they're in. But if it ends up having to be a message of laying people off, if that's the right thing for the business, the organization has to do the best thing for its shareholders, and there's no easy way to ease people into that message. Question?
So it seems to me the most obvious example right now that comes to mind about the trap like this is journalism, print journalism in American newspapers.
Yes.
And if you were to get hired by the Seattle Times, please, and go in and say, let's think about what you're doing, what your delivery is, what would your advice be in terms of their strategy moving forward?
That's a good question. Did you ever hear the question? Okay. I've actually written a couple blogs about this because I think there are a variety of industries that are caught up in the trajectory of how people are consuming information, but also it does interweave social networking. So where are people going to be, and it even slices up by demographic. So I'm a 43-year-old guy who's probably never going to not have a subscription to the New York Times. It's just something I always want to touch the paper. It's just, that's my experience. Also a pretty good bet that my 8.5-year-old son is never going to have a subscription to a newspaper. And so getting the Seattle Times, the New York Times, Facebook, other LinkedIn to say, okay, by demographic, how are they consuming content today? How has that changed in the last few years? Because a lot of articles are getting smaller and smaller, so people aren't wanting to read the full page New York Times articles as much as we used to. You know, what is the attention span? How much people want to read by content? Do they want to read the top 10 stories, like what's most urgent? Or are they like me, the person who will see an article off on the side of the page and say, I never would have searched for that? Like there was an article I remember in the New York Times about baby duckbill platypuses and which are called puggles, I learned, that the duckbill platypus is the perfect intersection between mammals and reptiles. And it's just this fascinating study on how much scientists learn. But I never would have searched on that. And so the question of how do you make information available to people that's interesting that's not on the top 10 list? I know there's probably a longer-winded answer to your question.
You're focused on the audience.
Yeah, know your audience. So look at the trend of the audience in terms of how they're consuming information differently, how their social networking patterns affect, like these people sending articles to their friends and family. All of that, I think, is that's the 10 and 20-year look at information and content consumption, is to say it's not so much about the newspapers today and the magazines today and the Facebook today. It's like, what's the trend? And the devices people are going to use to consume that. Is it going to be like text messaging? Do I want to get a text every time the Yankees win a baseball game? I don't. But so having those different options available, even some of the lessons I think we're learning from online banking, where the customer gets more control over what gets pushed to them, where they want help, where they don't want help. I think that's also going to be a factor in content. I think it's a giant problem that's just starting to take shape. And it's not the newspaper industry. It's a variety of content, social networking, timing, and demographics that will inform where we end up 10 or 20 years from now. And it's going to, we'll all be surprised. That's a longer answer than you probably wanted.
Have you done some studies specifically on Microsoft versus our competitors in terms of innovation and cost cutting?
Have I done research inside of Microsoft specific to cost-cutting innovation? I've done a lot of work inside of Microsoft in terms of helping divisions make prioritization decisions in terms of where investments make sense, both from a cost-cutting perspective and an innovation perspective. I have not specifically had the competitive discussion, but I know the manager. So I come in as the non-expert, which is sort of ironic, but I help expose this lens, this view of their work that they've not seen before, and then help talk them through the child-parent relationships, dependency discussions, because they've never seen these heat maps where they're like, wow, I've never had this view of my work. Help me make decisions about how I prioritize. So I know that they have had competitive discussions, and they've had more cost-cutting innovation discussions. I'm more of those, here's how you read the map, and here's how you should think about prioritizing it, both high-value, low-value stuff, and then saying, is it a people change, a process change, or a technology change? Have you already got projects funded in this area? Should you be rethinking your FY10 budgets for this area now that you've got this lens? That's the kind of conversation I have more internally. Question in the back?
Yeah, when it comes to rethinking, I've noticed that if you have everything to lose or nothing to lose, rethinking is easier. If you watch children play, they always, they will do things an adult will never dream of doing.
Yes.
And if you're in a company in a bankruptcy,
like wearing a Halloween costume to school on a non-Halloween day, yeah, I'll go as a spaceman today. That's something you or I probably would not do, wear that to work, right?
there's that. And then there's being in a bankruptcy,
Yep.
or impending bankruptcy, like this country
Yes.
has seen. And then all kinds of radical decisions are okay. Or
Yes.
they're forced upon.
That's right. Yep.
So I'm looking at it and I'm going, there's that, when you have nothing to lose and you have everything to lose.
That's right.
And then you have situations like ours, the company,
Yes.
fairly comfortable, we're still doing okay, and there's enough cash in the bank and there isn't much to lose. Rethinking,
Well, I wouldn't go that far, but okay.
rethinking becomes difficult in
It
that
does.
kind of environment.
So the urgency is missing.
Yes.
Well, but there's also-
urgency to tie in with rethinking is what I'm asking.
There's the analogy that I use, parents who have kids that are probably 10 or 12 years or younger will recognize. In the movie Finding Nemo, towards the end of the movie, Nemo's gotten out of his predicament and he's swimming home with his dad, and he ends up getting caught up in a big commercial fishing net. And the fishing net's being lifted up, and they're being successful in catching all these fish. And one of the lessons that Nemo had learned in his adventure was that if he told all the other fish to swim down in the net, they would be able to snap out of the net. And they end up, he tells them all to swim down, they all swim down, they break out of the net, and all the fish are fine. I think what happens in a lot of large organizations is you have people, it's a little bit like that shiny object project that I mentioned earlier, they think they're doing what's best for the company, but what they're doing is going in one direction, and what somebody else is doing is going in another direction, and so there's a lack of unity in terms of the direction of the efforts. And a company of our size, you're going to have multiple efforts going in a variety of directions, but I see a lot of different efforts that don't really align and snap to themselves, and they end up in some ways conflicting. I think that's the real opportunity, is to get that visibility, is to say which projects really need to be aligned, which ones are actually pointing at something different. So Robbie Bach's stuff at Xbox is going to be pointing at something that's very different from what Chris Cap is doing with Office 14, right? Or Wave 14. But they should be as aligned as they can within Wave 14 in terms of the value proposition, the demographics, the message, how we take that message to market. And I don't always see, and I'm using those as random examples. I'm not saying that Robbie or Chris are doing anything wrong specifically. I'm just saying I think there's an opportunity for much greater alignment of efforts so that we can be more unified in going after what we're chasing after. But you're right, the nothing to lose, everything to gain is much easier to do the rethinking than going into something that's already very complicated, probably very political, and testing some of those things. I do find that the heat maps tend to drive a more objective conversation, help drive people out of some of these more subjective shadows where they say, oh, just trust me, this is my stuff, I've always done it. No, let's put a flashlight on and take a look at it. And that can be uncomfortable for some people, but it ends up in the long run being a more productive conversation. I think we may have time for one more question. I was told to stop at 2:30. Yeah.
So, I mean, just to elaborate on that thought,
yeah.
You mentioned two different things. This whole discussion in the book, it seems that not to fall in the how trap,
yeah,
and try to go to the why and focus on, what.
What and why, yeah.
But when you relate that to Microsoft, do you think Microsoft has more of a how trap, or do you think it's an alignment issue between different businesses?
Both, I think, are true.
Because those are two separate things.
I agree. So from a how trap perspective, I have some actual deliverables that I produced internally where I had the shiny object conversation with people to say, okay, tell me what you think the 5 or 10 most important things are for your division. And in one particular division, I interviewed, I think, 44 people, and about 50% of the time, they named one specific thing as the most valuable thing that could be done in the organization, most impactful. But when I did the heat maps for them and did value and performance maps, that one thing actually came back as very mediocre impact, both as a parent-child relationship as well as value performance. And so I went back to them and said, you said this was most important, and yet here the heat map is telling a very different story. In that example, they're like, oh, you're right. These other two areas that are actually upstream of that one area, it does make sense for us to focus on those, and that will probably fix the one that we thought or we said was the most important thing. So as an individual discussion, and it turned out in that particular case, what's very common here is that people want to throw technology, they see technology as the primary fix to a specific problem. In a lot of cases, it's something upstream of the technology, like better information to go into the technology, better discussion with the customer, which is maybe something I should have said at the outset. One of the reasons I've been supported to do this book is that it helps Microsoft be better listeners to customers. So when United Airlines calls us, we can have that more objective. Even if we're not experts in the airline industry, we can be better listeners to the problem and saying, okay, we don't know that much about flight check-in, but we can help step you through the fact that expose it's about reservations, surveys, and logistics, and now we can talk about our best practices there. So that's the how trap question. The sort of departmental, divisional alignment discussion becomes somewhat of a how trap discussion at a higher level and say, okay, individual parent-child relationships for specific divisions are one thing. Does the one thing in this department have the opportunity to have alignment or leverage from this other area? You can have that conversation more objectively, I would assert, through the heat maps than you can with process workflows. That would be my assertion. I'd be happy to talk to you about that offline. I think we're running long. If people need to go, I'd be happy to answer other questions, though. Okay, thanks very much.